Now, when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection, he didn't know anything. Well, he thought he knew, and most people thought they knew about how things were inherited. And you can kind of look at this chart up here to get an idea of what he thought. Now, he thought there was something called blending inheritance. And when you do that, you end up with something, you put blue and yellow together, you get green. And in fact, over time, things would kind of get washed out. In other words, the trait that was favored would eventually kind of just get washed out. And that was a real problem. And it came up with all these other ideas to try to overcome this problem. Now, at about the same time, there was this fellow named Gregor Mendel, who was a monk in what's now Czechoslovakia. And he was doing experiments with pea plants and hybridization. And he actually showed that inheritance was not blended inheritance, but it's actually particulate. In other words, let's say you have a blue and a yellow. Anybody remember what a genotype is? What is it? Anybody? Come on. I'm going to pick someone. Uh-oh. I never come over here. What do you think it is? A genotype. Okay, so you know what allele is, right? Two different alleles. And a genotype, if you have a two allele system, okay. So let's say you have that, we'll call it allele A1 and allele A2. Now remember, we're diploid. You and I are diploid. We have one chromosome from our mama, one chromosome from our papa. We've got 23 pairs of these chromosomes, in other words, one from each parent. And so with a very simple model like this, we actually have three genotypes. We have A1, 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 stop that, A2, and then A2, and then A2. Okay? So, in terms of particulate inheritance, the genotype with the green is actually the heterozygote genotype. In other words, there's only two different alleles, and the individual that has one of each ends up with this genotype and phenotype that looks like green, A1, A2. Whereas if you had A1, A1, okay, so if you had A1, A1, you'd end up with that. If you had A2, A2, homozygous, you'd end up with that. And then here, you'd end up with the green. Okay, so in other words, even though it might seem like you're blending in terms of the phenotype is what anatomy, physiology, behavior, development, all that kind of stuff is. In other words, like our whole body. But in fact, we're actually inheriting things in terms of specific genes and alleles. Now, Darwin didn't know that. What's interesting is that Mendel actually had Darwin's book on the origin of species. And he even, I think, in some of his notes or in the paper that he published on this, in the margins he wrote something about Darwin, but he didn't actually quite connect it in terms of evolution by natural selection to Darwin. And it wasn't until 50 years later, in the early 1900s, that particulate inheritance was rediscovered. See, Mendel was an agriculturalist, right? He was trying to come up with different pea plants, different understanding how to get different characteristics in, let's say, plants. And he didn't really consider much beyond that, so he actually published in a kind of an agricultural journal that was kind of obscure and Darwin never came across. Okay. So, also obviously Darwin didn't understand about how mutations arose. And how genes were actually, or how traits were actually determined. In other words, genes code for a protein, they don't code for a trait. Proteins are the basis of those traits. And then he didn't understand anything about gene regulation and gene expression, which we'll start to approach later on. So here's a evolution of or evidence of microevolutionary change. And I have a whole bunch of different examples here. So remember, in terms of microevolution, we're looking at populations. That's the main thing. The gene pool, in other words, all the alleles and all the individuals in that population. And in terms of certain alleles are more likely to make an individual have higher fitness, in other words, more likely to survive and reproduce. So, in terms of evidence of microevolution, well, we've got all kinds of stuff. We've got antibiotic resistance in bacteria, pesticide resistance in insects, and then the first really nice study was this thing called industrial melanism. At the time, in the early 1950s, actually, it was noted beforehand, actually, in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Before that happened, there was most of the tree bark was light with lichens on it. These lichens are a mutualistic combination of fungi and moss. Okay, and it was pretty much white tree bark. And if you notice on the right, upper right, the white variant camouflages very well, but the dark one doesn't. And before Industrial Revolution, there were almost no dark morphs. No one ever really found them. But once the Industrial Revolution started, they used coal to burn to produce energy, so they could run their machines. And coal soot is very, very dirty, and it coated everything. Outside, inside people's lungs, people got all sorts of terrible infections, but at least they could stay warm. Well, it turns out eventually the same thing happens with antibiotics. Let's see where we are. We've got a population of dividing microbes, bacteria in this case. Over time, they divide and they divide and they divide. They make exact copies of themselves. They do it, this is called cloning. In other words, each one is just like the parent, except that once in a while a mutation comes in. So you end up here, you actually see red and blue mutations, and keeps occurring, and the microbial population continues to multiply, occasionally giving rise to more mutants, right? Well, if you change the selective environment for antibiotics, in other words, you give someone an antibiotic will kill bacteria. Antibiotics do not kill viruses or anything else. It's just bacteria. What will happen is we'll say it'll kill pretty much everything but those with the blue or kind of purple allele, the red one, the yellow one. It doesn't mean that it might actually kill most of the blue ones too, but not at the same rate as, let's say, the white ones that we found earlier. And the same thing goes for this. So eventually, these different alleles here have different levels of resistance to the antibiotic. They can detoxify it and survive in the antibiotic. The antibiotic does not cause these mutations. The antibiotic, there were already those mutations, kind of like getting a poker hand. You can't suddenly, in the middle of a poker hand, decide, oh, it would be much nicer if I had 3 kings instead of only 2 kings. In a poker hand, you have what you have. The same thing in terms of these microbes, or the same thing in terms of you. You're dealt the hand you have, you can't change it. So if you add an antibiotic, it kills all these other ones. If you keep taking it for, let's say, the full dose for 10 days, it'll probably kill all of them. But let's say you decide you're feeling much better after 2 days and you stop. And these other variants, these other alleles, are, in fact, more resistant, and some of them survive. And it turns out the mutants continue to grow and divide in the presence of the antibiotic, and they're resistant. They leave more offspring. This is natural selection, right? They leave more offspring in terms of resistant bacteria. And then eventually, the antibiotic no longer works. So that's microevolution, and it's a very common thing. And you might wonder, well, why is it so common? Well, it turns out that a lot of the antibiotics we actually get are from other microbes. And microbes kind of fight amongst each other with chemicals, with toxins. Okay? So we end up with these resistant forms. Okay. Let's see here. It would automatically do that. Okay. Start again. Okay. So, antibiotic does not cause the mutation. The mutation happens randomly, naturally. Most mutations are bad, and you don't see them. They just die off immediately. Others might be somewhat resistant, not very much, but a little bit to the antibiotic. They leave more copies of the cells. Other mutants arise the same way for random mutation. Some of those might be resistant as well. Eventually, in this experiment, they come to a plate, where there's now more antibiotic, 100 times more than initially where there was none. Again, they come up to it. All those strains, most of those strains go extinct. But there are some mutants in there that then result in the future population having more and more resistance until finally you end up with, at the very center, you end up with a mutation that gives that bacteria 1,000 times more resistance to the antibiotic than the original strain had. That's why you should all, when you are an antibiotic, you make sure you keep taking it for the full dose. Okay, so that's kind of how evolution works. You end up with random mutations. Most of them are probably bad. A few are good in terms of the environment. Now, okay, in the case of natural selection, what was the source of the genetic variation among individual bacteria? The environment or B, mutation? Anybody? Huh? Speak up. Say A or B. A, B. Okay. Okay. The environment changed. The selective environment. Before there were no antibiotics, bacteria grew, caused disease, but every time the bacteria copied itself and made new bacteria, once in a while there was a mutation that rose, and that mutation gave that individual bacteria resistance. In other words, the selective force, the selective environment was the antibiotic, and only those individuals that had the mutation survived. Let's see, random mutation. What was selective force causing the frequency of the population of bacteria to evolve antibiotic resistance? The antibiotic or the individual bacteria? A, B, A, B. What was causing, how did the environment change? Antibiotic was added to the environment. In other words, the person started, let's say, eating antibiotics. Antibiotics were around in their bloodstream, killed all the bacteria. So that's a selective force. It's like a bird coming along and picking moths that are dark colored on a light colored background. Same sort of thing. So in this case, the selective force, in other words, the environment has now changed. Those individuals with a mutant survive. So in this case, this one. How did the cause of selection, in other words, the antibiotics, change the selective environment? The antibiotics made the selective environment toxic to the bacteria, that's A, by causing random mutations. Remember, the antibiotics didn't cause any mutations. Some bacteria had mutations that made them resistant. The other ones didn't. They died. The force, in other words, of antibiotics, of selection was acting on the individual bacteria or the population. It's the individual bacteria. In this example, the genetic makeup of what changed over time? An individual bacteria, that's A, or population of bacteria? It's the population of bacteria. As I mentioned earlier, before the Industrial Revolution, like in the earlier 1700s, 18th century, the peppered moth was a light variety, and this one, and it was usually found on light-colored bark, like here, and you can barely see the white ones, the light ones, whereas the dark ones you can certainly see right there, right? So before then, there was almost no dark ones at all. There shouldn't have been because they got picked off by birds. Then, of course, Industrial Revolution started. They started burning coal. Everything was covered in soot in the outside, the tree bark, the houses, the people inside their lungs. It was a mess, but it powered the Industrial Revolution. The tree bark got dark. The light-colored morph was easy to spot, as you can see here. And the dark-colored morph actually blended in. And let's see, right here. And so now the black morph just came along. It was a random mutation. It soon went to almost fixation. So there were very, very, very few white-colored moths. And eventually a guy named Kettlewell in the 50s, 1950s, much later, did an experiment with birds and with moths, putting out dark ones in areas where there was light tree bark and the other way around, and showed which ones were getting eaten by birds. And it was also remarked by researchers during the 19th century, including around the time of Darwin, about the increasing frequency of those dark-colored morphs. Okay, we kind of already went through this. Among the individual moths, random mutation. Moths. Did the natural selection act on the population or the individual? Selection always acts on the individual. It's the population that actually changes. Individual. What was the cause of the selection on the moths? Random coal pollution. How did selection change the selective environment? In this case, it changed it because birds fed on the moths. If the birds could not see the moths, they couldn't feed on them. They couldn't find them very effectively. If they could see them, those are the ones they ate. Since the coal dust turned the tree trunks dark, that's the selective environment now has changed. The birds could only see the ones that had the light morph compared to the dark morph. So in this case, the first A is the correct answer. So the selective environment changed. How did the change in the color of the tree bark affect the frequency of the different color morphs? So, the selective environment changed. As the bark of more trees darkened, the frequency of the light morph increased. As the bark of the more trees darkened, the frequency of the dark morphs increased. If the bark got darker, which one increased? Dark one. Why did the frequency increase or decrease? The population of all moths decreased from being poisoned by the coal dust or the dark moths were better. Now, if I do that for about 5 minutes, that means I'm having a stroke. In other words, there's selection going on here, and it ain't good. Okay. The dark moths were better camouflaged from the predator birds than the light ones. Once pollution control stopped the burning of coal, and coal soup no longer covered everything, which peppered moth morph would be favored? The dark morph or the light morph?
The light.
Right. Genetic makeup of the population changed, not the individuals. Which color morph is the best? Huh?
C.
Huh?
C.
Depends on the environment, exactly. In other words, selection does not, there is no such thing as the perfect mutant or the perfect allele. It depends on the environment. An allele that conferred higher fitness in one environment is now bad, and the other allele is favored. Okay, now, we've been talking basically about selection on survival, right? But if you think of the life stages of an organism, life stages change. We first start with a zygote, which is just one cell that is diploid now. If there's a mutation in that zygote that, let's say, is bad, that zygote's dead. Selection has acted on it, right? It's not like selection, it's just that it had a bad mutation, it died. The same thing goes on even after it divides as an embryo. If at a certain point the embryo actually has a mutation in it that causes it to die, that's selection as well. So for example, the Zika virus attacks neuron stem cells. And that's why you end up with babies with brain damage. So what the Zika virus does is it actually causes mutations to arise in the neuronal stem cells. And then those babies develop all these terrible abnormalities. So in this case, the Zika virus is the new selective environment. Okay? Now, let's say you have an individual that actually makes it to adulthood. Okay. Forget about the bacteria. Eventually, as adults, to reproduce, they have to find other adults of the other sex and produce babies. Now, it turns out, remember I told you about this guy who's, he's a bad boy. He gets around, has sex with a lot of women, leaves lots of offspring. Eventually, well, at a young age he dies because one of the women's boyfriends or husbands shoots him. But in the meantime, he's left a lot of offspring. That's called sexual selection. The bad boy appears sexy to partners, and they have sex with him. Now, we're going to get to this in more detail later, but just think of like a bird's plumage. The males have a bright, like a peacock, have a bright plumage. The females don't. The ones with the brightest plumage, females have sex with. Okay, so that's sexual selection. Now, of course, they still have to survive, right? And so those individuals that are more likely to survive can have more sex and leave more offspring. So that's survival selection. Okay, and then fecundity selection. In other words, how many offspring you actually make. In this case, let's say this guy creates 40 different offspring. And then finally, there's something called gametic selection, where you can actually have competition inside the vaginal tract between different sperm from different people. Okay. So here's some examples of survival selection again. We've got these black birds against a dark background. The green ones stand out, the other ones not so much. The birds eat all the green ones, you end up with others that are more camouflaged. In Australia, when the English first got there, they some of them were homesick. One of the animals they brought were bunnies. Soon the bunnies multiplied like rabbits do and covered the landscape. And not only wasn't there enough food for the native wildlife, but for also their sheep. Okay? So they had to figure out a way to actually, perhaps, get rid of the bunnies. They brought in a virus, and if you actually look on this graph right here, this is when myxomatosis was released. Along the bottom, the x-axis is years. So it was released in the late 50s. Rabbit abundance. Now there was a lot of things going on with rabbits, but a lot of rodents, their populations tend to fluctuate because they overrun their food supply. Anyway, what happened? The population crashed. Okay? Now, over time, just so you know, there was coevolution going on. The pathogen didn't kill as many rabbits, and the rabbits evolved a certain amount of resistance. So instead of killing 99% of all the rabbits when it was first released, now the mortality was about 30 to 40%. Kind of like what smallpox was to humans. Here's fecundity selection again, by the way. A plant with tons and tons and tons of seeds or fruits. Here's sexual selection. So, in general, and we're going to find out why in a bit, but males compete for females. Females, if you think about sperm are cheap. Males make billions of sperm. Females generally don't make billions of eggs. Eggs are more expensive. They have constituents that help the embryo grow when it's fertilized. So you end up with something where males compete. The one that's left standing gets all the females. You also have a situation where female choice. Some males are sexier than others. Isn't that how it is? Now, it turns out with humans, it's both ways. Males and females both compete. And there's both choice and also sometimes drama in terms of sexual selection. Okay, now it turns out we've been talking, let's say, about selection on survival. Or we could actually talk about sexual selection as well. Let's talk about the wolves again. No, in fact, let's talk about, the wolves is fine. Okay, wolves, if the farther north you go, the thicker the fur. It gets colder, farther north, they have pretty thick fur. if the population, if the weather changed, or the climate changed, and it got warmer, would thick fur be favored or disfavored? Disfavored. Okay, so eventually, those individuals that had, in terms of variation, had shorter fur would leave more offspring, and the future population would be made up of individuals that had shorter fur. That's called directional selection. So we're going to look at these in turn, but just so you get an idea that there's different kinds of selection going on in terms of properties that are being favored or disfavored. Okay, so this kind of goes through it. You go see stabilizing selection. Okay. Actually, let's do directional selection first. The environment changes until finally the mean was right around there. It's now shifted more and more to the right as, let's say, the fur, if it got colder, the fur of the wolves got longer. It can go the other way too. It can go this way. If the climate got warmer, you'd end up with fur that was shorter. That's directional selection. Stabilizing selection is where there's selection against the ends of the distribution. Let's say those with short fur and long fur, very long, very short, or let's say beaks of the birds. Big beaks, short beak, small beaks, okay? And eventually you end up with a population that's been whittled down so that only those individuals right in the middle do better. And then you have disruptive selection, the same sort of thing, and all you're left with eventually are on the ends. We'll say fur length, 0 to 100, and abundance. In other words, number of wolves. This is what the population looked like. Here's the mean, that's the average length. Most individuals in that population were right in the middle. There were more individuals of a certain length. As the population got warmer, who died? All these individuals, or they left fewer offspring. Okay, so now all you have left are these individuals over on the left end in terms of fur length or fur density. And then we end up with this one. Come on, you can do it. I know you can. Okay, now, so this is directional selection. Okay. So, things have shifted from here towards this way. If the climate got colder, you could also have directional selection going the other way, where everything shifted. So if it got warmer, if it got colder, I can't do that. What would happen is that all these would die. You'd have a few individuals here. They would leave more individuals, and eventually the population would shift to the right. Okay. Here's an example of directional selection. The Galapagos. There's all these finches. Their closest relatives are in South America, on the coast. They eat seeds. There was a drought where no seeds were produced. If you actually look at, let's see here. Okay. This is the number of finches, high of, let's say, 1,400. Up here, the drought happens, the finch population crashes. In fact, it almost goes extinct. The only ones that are left have very large beaks because the only seeds that are left are very hard seeds. So you need very thick beaks to actually crack them. And so you see actually, now, what you actually see here is directional selection. Started here, and then eventually it moved over here. But just so you know, it took a while for the finch population to actually increase. Eventually the drought ended. And you can actually see heritability here. So this is mid-parent bill depth and offspring bill depth. There's a strong correlation in terms of bill size, right? And it turns out that you can see that bill size is actually heritable. And the ones that were left more offspring with thicker bills. So this is an example of directional selection. Okay. Anybody in here have kids? Okay. How big? When the kid was born, how big was the kid? Okay.
It was, I think, like 6
6, 7 pounds. Okay. Now, remember, it turns out human babies have very large heads. In fact, they're actually born premature. Because we actually have to get out. Like, let me out, right? Well, it turns out, if we look at this graph here, this is called stabilizing selection. Here's percent of the population. Let's see, or mortality. So right here, oops, this bit is mortality. So you have high mortality in terms of low birth weight and high birth weight. And you have low mortality here, in other words, high survival in the middle in terms of birth weight. So those babies that are generally between, let's say, 5 or 6 and, let's say, 8 or 9 pounds, they're favored in terms of birth weight. Underweight babies, they generally don't have as high a survival as normal-sized babies. They don't have as much resources. And so they usually have lower survival, higher mortality, as we see up here. Now, of course, on the other end, high birth weight babies, they tend to not only kill themselves, but their mothers as well. And so there's really strong selection against anything on either end. So here we are again. We've got this mode of, and this is size. And then eventually, obviously, we would have strong selection. And so eventually, you'd end up with individuals that are very few here, mostly right in the middle. And stronger selection, so you'd end up with even more. It's just very narrow, okay? So that's stabilizing selection. Okay. Okay, and then here we have what's called disruptive selection. Let's say birds that had very large beaks or very thin beaks are favored. The ones in the middle, not so much. Because there's large seeds and small seeds. The ones with a large bill are not very good at finding the small seeds. But they can break the big ones, and vice versa. And so, as you can see, these are the ones that died, and those are the ones that survived, right? And so you end up with these populations where the median bill depth is either around 15 or around 11. That means there's now what's called a bimodal distribution. So if we had this thing again where we had a normal distribution on beak size, if you had two different seed sizes, you would have strong selection right in the middle, and you'd only end up with individuals over here. And, okay, so again, you end up with a bimodal distribution because everything in the middle, those with medium-sized beaks, they get outcompeted by the small beaked finches and the large beaked finches. So this is called disruptive selection. Now, remember, we can put this in terms of hypotheses. We can actually make predictions, can't we? So, in terms of, let's say, directional selection, if the weather changes and it gets colder, we can predict that, in fact, wolves with denser fur will survive better and reproduce better, and in the future the population will be full of wolves with denser fur. So, we've made a hypothesis that, in fact, fur gives some sort of benefit to a wolf under colder climate. The prediction, of course, is longer fur is better. And then you'd expect, and you can actually test this, or you can use this as an observational study, would expect the population over time to have denser fur. Okay? So remember, this is what science is. It's not a bunch of facts. It's actually hypothesis testing. This is what people did, scientists did, in terms of looking at, they'd see things in nature where it seems like one population, let's say, had, well, look at the moths. When there's lots of soot, it seems like most of the moths are dark versus the other way around. They come up with a hypothesis. Why is this so? The force of selection is the coal dust changing the tree trunk's color, resulting in some individuals surviving and reproducing compared to the others. Now, there's also something that, there's different kinds of selection. This is called negative frequency dependent selection. Anybody ever go salmon fishing? No. Okay. You should try it. Anyway, this big fish on the right is up on the Kenai Peninsula. Oops. And that's a big fish. You actually wouldn't want to eat it. It's a male. It's all the energy has gone into reproducing and not into maintaining. So the meat would be pretty rank, actually. Now there's also these little fish. These little fish there are actually mature. Okay? And you would think, well, if you're fighting for access to females and releasing sperm, who's going to win? The big guy, right? However, if you're a little guy, you don't have much chance unless you're what's called a sneaky male. That means you find a female that's digging out a red, laying her eggs, and you're hiding behind a rock. And while the big males are duking it out, you dart in, you release all your sperm, you fertilize all the eggs, and then you go on to the next female while these big guys are duking it out. Now, obviously, being in that kind of a situation, being a small male is better. Except that if there's a lot of small males, they're called jacks, then they're all competing for sites near females where they can hide. In other words, their fitness actually goes down the more jacks there are. So the same thing with the big ones. If there's few big ones but lots of jacks, you're better off being big. Because there's a lot of them, but they have nowhere to hide. Okay, so the frequency varies over time. Now this is also what you would call, remember about the seed size and beak size, small and large? This is called, what kind of selection? Disruptive. Large size and small size. These aren't different species. It just depends on the environment that they're in and how it changes over time. Okay. Sexual selection. It depends not on a struggle for existence or survival, but on a struggle between, let's say, males for access to females. So, you know how guys get jealous? Well, women get jealous too. It's called mate guarding. In other words, you want to make sure that you keep other males away from your woman or vice versa from your man. Okay? Now, the only reason with humans that it has both is that there's biparental care. In other words, individuals who put more resources into offspring are the ones that can be choosy. So with humans, it's both. So this is, in the middle here, is an Irish elk. You can see how large it was. Okay. And what it would do is it would compete, it would drive the smaller males away, and it would have a harem. So it might have a harem of, let's say, 20 or 30 or 40 individuals. And it was always fighting, and eventually over time, during the season, it would probably lose the harem and would be replaced by some other male. The same thing happens with modern day elk and a lot of other animals. So it's called a harem mating system. And then there's other situations, like with a lot of very colorful birds, where we have males that are brightly plumaged, and we have females that are not, and they're choosy. And the ones with the brightest plumage are picked by the females, mainly because the brightest plumage kind of gives an indication of how good the male is. If you can afford to have this plumage and not get eaten by a predator, it means you have pretty good genes. In this way, of course, if the male is still there and hasn't been eaten, it's a pretty good indication that he's got good genes. And the female uses this, obviously, as a way to determine which male she wants to mate with. In fact, the females are very picky. We'll see a video a little bit later in terms of these birds of paradise, in terms of what she's looking at, and because she wants the best possible genes for her offspring. Here is YouTube of some male bull elk along the Yellowstone River, duking it out. Bull elk, the males have harems, so the strongest one gets all the female elk and drives the other males off, and gets to mate with all the females and produce offspring. Obviously, male-male competition, he wins, he has the higher fitness. Now, usually though, as time goes on during the season of the rut, which is in the fall, the the bull elk that has a harem usually ends up not doing much but having sex, and so gets rather weak, and eventually someone usurps this position and takes over, and then has sex with all the other females and may get a couple of offspring out of it.